But seriously, thank you to CGI for this wonderful opportunity. I can't think of a better place in time or on this planet to share with you McKinsey Global Institute's new work on gender equality. This is a project that we felt at MGI, which is McKinsey and Company's economic think tank, whose time had really come, given the context of 2015 and the fact that 185 nations are uniting around a goal of gender equality for the first time. I do have some slides which could be put up, but while they are put up, this is a research effort that we led on gender equality. It's a global study on gender equality, but it's really a global study on growth, on jobs, on productivity, and the prosperity that all this can bring through gender equality. So we looked at a canvas of about 95 countries around the world, which represent more than 90% of world GDP, as well as the population of the world's women. And we started by thinking about what the gender gaps in work really are. And there are three kinds of gender gaps that we identified in the world of work. And these are really around labor force participation, which is that fewer women around the world actually work in the paid economy in exchange for a wage or income. Women do a disproportionate share of unpaid work, but a less than proportionate share of paid work. So there are gaps in labor force participation. There are also gaps in the hours that women work. So even women who do work struggle to balance their commitments and end up spending less time in paid work than they could. And finally, there are gaps in productivity. So women who do work tend to be concentrated in sectors where productivity and therefore wage earning opportunities are lower than that of men. So we thought about what the world would look like if these three gaps were narrowed, if not completely bridged. And what we found, we didn't find that. Yeah, that's what we found. That's the answer, which is that across the 95 countries that we looked at, the economic value of closing the gap or narrowing the gap could be $12 trillion more of economic output and therefore of prosperity for the world in the year 2025. This is equivalent to about more than 1 percentage point of global economic growth every year. For more than half the countries we looked at, the additional growth that they could contribute was in excess of 1 percentage point per year. And this is inclusive growth that actually creates up to 240 million more jobs, which means 240 million more households where women are working, earning, and able to plow back that income into building social capital for the next generation. And this is not even the value of fully closing the gender gap. This is not a world where women and men are identically participating in the economy. This is simply a world where every country mimics or achieves the fastest improving rates of its own neighbors, its own peers who are within its own social and cultural context. So countries in the Middle East and North Africa would improve at the same rate as the UAE or Turkey. Countries in Latin America would improve at the same rate of Chile. So this has actually been done. There's empirical evidence that it can be done. And if more countries do this, there's a huge economic prize out there, not just for countries, but for human beings and citizens. Now, this will not get achieved, which was our next key finding, without important gender gaps in society being bridged. So you can't really segregate or divorce a woman from her role in the economy and her role in society. So we broadened the canvas to really look at a set of indicators that bridge not just gender equality in work, but these three other categories that are up here. The first is equality in terms of access to essential services like health, education, financial inclusion, and access to technology or digital connectivity. These are important enablers of economic opportunity for people. The second category is legal and political representation. So is there legal protection for women? And do women have their fair share of political voice through representation in elected offices at various levels? And the third element we looked at, particularly interesting for today's discussion, is physical security, autonomy, the integrity of your own body, your own personal rights, freedom from bodily harm. And across these indicators, what we did is for the 95 countries, we constructed these two measures of how equal each country is, first on the dimension of gender equality in work, and then on the dimension of gender equality in society, which is all the other indicators we just talked about. And what we found is a very, very strong correlation. The two go hand in hand, and it's really difficult for an economy to achieve high equality in work without the foundation of high equality in society as well. And of course, it's a virtuous cycle, so doing one aids the other. But it's really important to note that if you don't have equal societies, gender equal societies, you are imposing big barriers on the ability of women to participate as full partners in the economy. Unfortunately, many of these gaps and barriers persist, and I'm going to just focus on the three in the last bucket around physical security. We looked at these three, which sort of trace the violence faced by women and girls from birth all the way into adulthood. The first indicator is the sex ratio at birth, violence faced at birth or in infancy, which results in 1.5 million missing girls and women each year. It's a problem concentrated in certain parts of the world. India and China actually account for the bulk of the problem, but it's a sizable and fairly stubborn problem. The second element of violence we looked at is violence in childhood, where we use the proxy of child marriage, an institution that robs young girls and women of basic physical integrity and reproductive rights. 36 million women by our measure around the world are impacted by having been married as children. Again, the problem is concentrated more in developing parts of the world. And then violence against women, where we use the proxy of intimate partner violence, which unfortunately is a globally pervasive issue. 1 in 3 women around the world who have been surveyed have stood up and said that they have been victims of intimate partner violence, and that's likely to be an underrepresentation of the true figure. Every region that we looked at had a number between 20 and 40%. Whether it was a poorer developing economy with lower levels of education, or indeed whether it was a richer economy where some of the other gender gaps have been bridged, but this one persists. We found 2 root causes worth mentioning. One is gender gaps in education are very closely linked with violence in the developing part of the world, where we see that once women attain a certain educational status, their attitudes about violence and their attitudes about preference for a male child, the son preference, dramatically comes down. So education becomes a leveler that overrides some of these cultural attitudes. And the other root cause that we found was associated with violence against women was really attitudes and mindsets that almost transcend education. So we found that even in richer countries, as many as 10 to 20% of surveyed women who are victims of intimate partner violence believe that it's justified. And it's justified by small things like arguing with your husband, like burning food, or leaving your house without telling your husband. So as Ashley said, there is a mindset of vulnerability that propagates itself and becomes very core to this problem actually not going away. What can be done about this? We looked at interventions across all elements of gender equality. We came up with some 75 different interventions that we've seen in practice in different parts around the world, and we grouped them according to these themes. What's interesting is that some of the most successful interventions have combined multiple aspects and sort of integrated them into a program as opposed to thinking just about one part of the solution. A child marriage program in Ethiopia, for example, has used financial transfers or cash transfers to induce girls to stay back in school for more education because education is so critical. They've also used a lot of the community dialogues to shape attitudes, not just in girls, but in men, in boys, and in older women who are sometimes perpetrators of some of these elements of violence. Or take technology and infrastructure. This is a great example of, I think, technology, I think, is a very promising intervention area to look at for the future. There are examples of the Bell Bajao TV campaign in India, viewed by 200 million viewers. What it sought to do is to focus the attention of men and boys on domestic violence. And what it really presented is the proposition that if you hear somebody screaming in the little flat or the little tenement next door, ring the bell. Bell bajao means ring the bell. So intervene, ring the bell, even if it's to make an innocuous request for sugar because you've run out of it. Ring the bell and show that society is watching. Technology enabled, but combined with a lot of street theater, community interventions to change mindsets at different levels. The economic opportunity creation is particularly important. We've seen evidence that once women have more financial independence, that's associated with less domestic violence. And this can happen both in a very targeted way. So for example, in Pakistan, there is one example of victims of violence being offered jobs in beauty parlors and other sorts of service sectors. And this can also be a broader economic play where a country invests in job creation in sectors which are very friendly to women, like garment manufacturing. And that kind of raises the systemic status of women as opposed to the status only of victims of violence. What was particularly interesting, we thought, was that more than half the interventions that we catalogued in our research are actually areas where the private sector and businesses can play a very important role, either on their own or in collaboration, and largely in collaboration with the government and the social sector. And particularly interesting is the fact that this is good for society, but it's also very good for business. It's very good for self-interest, and therefore there is a real coming together of interests that can take the agenda forward. Just to give you a couple of examples, the bank in Turkey that figured that women entrepreneurs are a very underserved segment and actually came up with a very innovative product offering that made loans against gold jewelry. Women in Turkey didn't really have property or access to other formal assets that they could borrow against, but most of them had a little bit of gold, and they could collateralize that, and the bank built a very profitable, almost $1 billion book of high-quality loans to women entrepreneurs on the back of this. Or the consumer company that figured that to actually get to rural consumer households where women are making purchasing decisions, the best way is to build a fleet of women sales agents, and built a 70,000 strong fleet of these women who went around with little backpacks and sold consumer products from door to door. So a lot of self-interest in there, a lot of potential for coalitions to come together. And the last sort of really important idea, I think, is that there is so much that can be done. What we do need is more focus on data to establish what works and what doesn't work, and more focus on sharing best practices. And that's where coalitions can really play a big role, because it is about changing one mind at a time, but we need to actually change millions of minds at the same time, because we don't really have time to wait. We are actually quite optimistic and hopeful that a lot of progress will be made on these fronts. The economic prize is certainly very large, and I think countries and even companies who spot this opportunity and do something about it will end up in a better place. Thanks.